Hello, my name is Harun Abdi, and for my intellectual AV mix, I want to let you guys know about the Harlem Renaissance. The impact it had and how it may very well be the movement that led to the civil rights movement with the work of one of the great leaders during the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. The Harlem Renaissance was this development of the neighborhood Harlem in New York City as a sort of black cultural hub in the early 20th century. And it resulted in black artistic explosion feeding into black American culture. The Harlem Renaissance was about 2 decades and a half long, and it is considered a period of a golden age for African American culture, bringing about new literature, new music, and new art.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era began after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
I want to first talk about this great migration. So the neighborhood Harlem was in the northern part of Manhattan, and it was meant to be an upper class white neighborhood in the 1880s. But overdevelopment caused a bunch of empty buildings, and these landlords were desperate to fill these empty buildings and make some money. So in the early 1900s, middle class black families migrated from a black neighborhood known as Black Bohemia to Harlem. And sequentially, other black families followed. The white families that still lived in the neighborhood fought to have the blacks there, but eventually failed and started to flee. And then the neighborhood became overrun with African Americans. Next, I want to share my reason for picking the Harlem Renaissance as my topic for this intellectual AV mix. And it's none other than Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was one of the most important writers and poets of the Harlem Renaissance, and he was a great leader. Langston Hughes' creative genius was influenced by New York City, Harlem. And his literature speaks about promoting equality for black people, condemning racism and injustice, and celebrating African American culture, humor, and music and literature.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
I dropped this poem in here by Langston Hughes titled I Too to demonstrate how he was a critical part in the Harlem Renaissance and how he has a big impact on civil rights for black Americans in the United States. I Too is a poem protesting against racism. The speaker is a black man, and he talks about how he's being excluded from American society. A thing that shouldn't happen since he is a key part of American society. He argues through the injustice of racism and segregation that black people developed a beautiful culture and a beautiful cultural tradition. So powerful that white society has no choice but to acknowledge the black contributions to American life and to American society. In this poem, the speaker insists that he is American and that his community, the black American community, has contributed just as much as the white society to the American life. This poem portrays American racism as experienced by a black man. And in this poem, white people deny the speaker a literal and metaphorical seat at the table. And in the poem, the speaker reiterates that he is just as much as part of America as our white people, and that the whole country will soon be forced to acknowledge that fact. The Harlem Renaissance really set the stage for the civil rights movement. Langston Hughes was very important to African American history because his work propelled the education and civil rights movement by dedicating his life to portraying experiences of black life in America. His work established class in the African American community. And once the Great Depression hit, the Harlem Renaissance faded. Then 2 decades later, the civil rights movement began.